Why does Bitcoin mining need the nuclear energy? Why is this connection between Bitcoin on the one hand and nuclear energy on the other hand such an amazing combination? Today we talk about that with the nuclear Bitcoiner, Ryan. He is an amazing guest, has been on, I think, one or two times already before, and it was an amazing deep dive into what is nuclear energy, how does it relate to Bitcoin, why this combination is so important to know for every Bitcoiner, especially because we are living through this cosmic shift in money. Enjoy. Hi Ryan, how are you doing? Everything fine on your end?
Hey Robin, I'm doing awesome. It's a new year and things are looking great. Sats have been on sale for a few months and yeah, life's good.
Sats on a discount and life is good. You get more sats for the same amount of fiat salary.
Yeah, well, in Canadian dollar we're still under 1,000 sats per dollar, so it's not quite like the Americans are getting more than 1,000 per dollar, so kind of jealous, but it all works out the same.
It does. It's so funny because like we're always saying like $1 million of Bitcoin, and then you go to some currencies and we're already over 10 million, depending on what the fiat currency is. And Australia and Canada is a little bit higher, I think, to the normal dollars. Then the euro where I live is even like closer than that. It just shows how messed up the whole fiat currency system is and how many different weird systems there are.
Yeah, it's funny because I can see the strength in the Canadian dollar against the US dollar by viewing the Bitcoin price in the two different currencies at any given time.
Oh, interesting. So kind of like the Bitcoin in the middle, where we have it as a unit of account, and then measuring how strong they are in even in relation to the other ones.
Yeah, because depending on different like political events and policy moves, like they'll change at different rates against each other. But yeah, Bitcoin stays that nice common denominator.
I really love our conversations because I learn a lot about nuclear power, and I think today we really dive into what nuclear power actually is, what is the relationship to nuclear power with Bitcoin, and why nuclear powers I think also are getting expensive to build, and why this is, and what the fiat system has to do with everything. Maybe let's just kick it off with what do you think? Like, what is nuclear power, and like what should the viewers really understand about the relationship also to Bitcoin with it?
Yeah, well, I was going to start with just a few simple core ideas about how nuclear power works. Like that, yeah, that chart shows a decay rate of specifically cobalt 60, and like I like sharing the decay rate charts, especially with Bitcoiners, because we're already familiar with that curve because it is the exact same pattern that the Bitcoin issuance rate follows. But yeah, to kind of go a little further back from that, but because um, these energy technologies like nuclear power and hydrocarbons, they're basically rearranging matter at an atomic level. Whereas with chemical energy, when you're burning a hydrocarbon, you're rearranging the the atoms themselves. You're rearranging like the electron orbitals, and you're just changing which atom is attached to another atom. But in nuclear energy, we're rearranging the atoms at the nucleus level. So like the center of the atom where the protons and the neutrons reside. It's changing their form or adding more neutrons or taking neutrons away or converting protons into a neutron. Or in the case of fission power, you're creating an unstable nucleus that will just split apart and release energy. And then we capture that energy using various mediums, predominantly water. There's also like graphite, there's lead, you can use molten salts. But essentially, the idea is you're releasing heat and you're capturing that heat to then do other productive work, which primarily is to spin a turbine and create electricity. Uh,
Interesting.
Yeah, so that chart that you showed there is just with the decay rates. Why I why I find this an interesting relation to Bitcoin, not just because that follows the same pattern, but because it's also a probabilistically randomized pattern. So if you have, say, a clump of cobalt 60, you don't know which atom is specifically going to be the next one to decay, but over time, you can infer a pattern that looks exactly like this from observing it decaying over time, which is similar to how Bitcoin behaves, which is very interesting because it makes you wonder if Satoshi was inspired by a natural process like nuclear fission when he was determining the optimal issuance rate, because it follows the exact same pattern. And so it's like a micro uncertainty as to, like, we don't know which block is going to be the next one to be mined by which miner, what transactions are going to be in it, and what nonce is going to be the one that finally unlocks it to be appended to the end of the blockchain. Just like we don't know which atom is going to be the next one to decay in a kilogram of of a nuclear element. So that's an interesting natural enforcement of a trustless system.
This seems like too big of a coincidence for it to be a coincidence. It's like if it follows it exactly, because he could have chosen so many other variables that makes it different, right?
Yeah, absolutely. He could have made it like issued it in many different ways. It could have just been like a consistent issuance that that decreases over time. He could have made it just a stable issuance over time with no end to it. There's any number of ways that it could have been configured, and it does feel like parts of it are just arbitrary. Like, why did he start at 50? It could have started at 100, and then there would be 42 million Bitcoin completely issued. But ultimately, that doesn't really matter because it's still going to be an absolutely fixed, finite amount of Bitcoin when we finally reach the terminal end after, what is it, like 32, 33 halvings. And it's also cool
Yeah,
how we know exactly when those are going to be.
I often I often wonder how he got to those numbers. Like, are all those numbers calculated? Was there some reasoning behind it, or was it kind of like, yeah, they should be in that ballpark, and just like I use 50 because it's like kind of a nice round number. It's like the half of 100.
It did work out nicely, but yeah, it feels like it was just kind of arbitrary. Like the actual numbers chosen don't have that much, like like they don't matter that much compared to just how they trend over time. The more interesting one is like the difficulty adjustment, how he set it up to be perfectly 2016 blocks. If they're timed perfectly at 10 minutes, that works out to exactly 14 days, which that's an interesting coincidence. And then there's the other coincidence that 2016 is the opposite of 6102, which is a number that Bitcoiners are familiar with, being the order that when Roosevelt confiscated the gold back in the 30s. So just a lot of interesting, like, little tidbits in there that just make it so interesting, but it feels like it was put together with intent, with an interesting intention of just how, but still randomly and arbitrarily chosen values that fit
That's
together.
crazy. It's like almost like I ask myself a lot how much of that is intent. I mean, this 6102, like this seems that it could be intentionally be in there because like he obviously knew about gold. He obviously knew about the monetary history and was very informed in that way. But there's like a lot of those questions in my mind, like this 21 million, like where does this come from?
21's a good number. But then 42 is a good number too, because that was the answer to the universe. If anyone's watched Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, so he could have chose that, and everybody would have been like, "Oh, that's why he chose that, because of that historical reason." And there's yeah, it just, the pieces fit together perfectly, and he solved a puzzle that nobody thought would be able to be put together. And now we have a new thing in the world that's not like anything else that ever existed before. And people like you and I are just figuring out how to move it forward in the world and educate people to understand what this thing is.
And with that chart, so basically the radioactive half-life is the same curve as the decaying of, or like the supply shrinking for Bitcoin, the new issuance of the supply. You mean?
Yeah, it's kind of like each element has a unique half-life. So cobalt 60, specifically. So it shows it in increments of just 1, 2, 3, 4 as just like each halving, but in years where Bitcoin will be at about 4 years, Cobalt 60 is about, I think about it's like, no, Cobalt's 5 years. There's like Cesium 137 is like 13 years. They all have different half-lives, but they're inferred from observations, whereas Bitcoin was an engineered system that just has these properties that behave very similarly to how a radioactive element decays over time. So if you almost think about like if Bitcoin just started as one single unit and then it's releasing the Bitcoins and the Satoshis to us as subatomic particles for us to use and transfer and assign value to, it has just remarkable similarities to something that just naturally occurs.
So the rate of it is the same. The
Yeah,
rate. Okay, interesting. I love
like
that.
the patterns, just the time, is just different for each element. So like some elements will have half-lives in the milliseconds, while some have half-lives in the hundreds of thousands of years. And so that's how we end up with a range of different elements comprising the earth and the crust and the core and all of these things where they've were put there from like supernovas that happened billions upon billions of years ago, but then just over time, their natural properties have decayed into different elements. So we have different amounts of them in different concentrations in different parts of the world. And like that's why like uranium is found in various like pockets throughout the world. Like we have a lot in northern Canada. There's lots in places like Kazakhstan. There's a lot in parts of Africa. But then there's other parts of the world where there's like almost no presence of uranium whatsoever.
Interesting. That's crazy for me. There's that this is the same thing, like the same pattern. Let's move on.
Yeah, what else can we get to? I think I have another chart here. I'll find. Yeah, because I have this one is another one that I like to use because it shows an example of how nuclear fission is actually working. So the element that we're using when we perform nuclear fission is uranium-235. What's interesting about that is it's only naturally occurring in about 0.7% of all the uranium that we find naturally in the ground when we mine it. It's mostly made up of uranium-238, which is not fissile. So what we have to do is we have to create an environment where we can ensure that the uranium-235 is going to have like a high enough cross section so that when it comes in contact with a neutron, it's going to become unstable and then split into two lighter elements, and then it releases a bunch of energy that we capture, and then it also releases as many as 2 or 3 more neutrons when this collision occurs, and then it splits and then more neutrons. So what we're trying to do is create a situation where only one of those neutrons will then continue on to collide with the next U-235 element, and then so on and so on. And that's what creates the chain reaction. So if you've ever heard the term criticality, so if we're at a perfect one-to-one ratio with neutrons being absorbed to neutrons being creating collisions and fissile events, that's critical. And then subcritical means that we're have a lower amount of neutrons per fissile events, and then supercritical means that we're having more neutrons than we're having fissile events. So those are occurrences that we try to avoid because we want to have it optimized right at 1-to-1. If you have too many, you can have a runaway reaction and it releases too much energy, which is one of the things that occurred in the nuclear accidents that we're familiar with, Chernobyl and Fukushima. And whereas if you don't have enough, the reaction cannot continue to proliferate. It basically runs out of fuel. So there's different ways that we can accomplish this. And in the traditional like light water reactors that are used throughout most of the world, in America and France and parts of Europe, they have to enrich it. So they're increasing the concentration of U-235 to U-238. So then that creates more fuel available for the fission reaction. Because what happens when you're using water as your moderator, water the the water molecules will actually absorb the neutrons, and they slow down the ability for them to proliferate in the reaction. Whereas there's a special type of reactor that Canada uses called the CANDU reactor, and we use heavy water. So we're using water where the hydrogen molecule already has an extra neutron on it, so it is less likely to absorb it. So that gives us a unique feature where when the fuel that we use in CANDU reactors doesn't need to be enriched. So it reduces a lot of like extra work that needs to be put into developing the fuel, and it takes away the risk that people observe of the potential for making it so enriched that it can be used for weapons grade fuel. But then there's other reactors like the submarine reactors, like they use very highly enriched uranium because they need it to be as small of a volume as possible because they have limited space. So they can take a few kilograms of uranium and that will fuel them for nearly a decade before they need to be refueled again. But like the CANDU reactors, because we're only using like a very small amount of fuel that's that can be we can get useful energy out of, we have to refuel pretty consistently. Like every 18 months, there's new fuel being added into the reactors. So it's just different amounts of the fissile material can create different environments for how much energy we can get out of them and how often we had to keep them like basically stoking the fuel to keep the reaction going.
That is a lot.
Yeah.
I think I've understood like 10%. But what is nuclear fission? Like I know nuclear fusion, but fission is something else now.
Yeah, well, fission, this is fission that we have on the screen here, where the neutron it'll make contact with the nucleus of the uranium-235, and then it becomes unstable, and it just splits apart, releases a ton of energy, and now you've got two smaller, lighter elements. They normally split somewhere around like the mass, like the atomic mass of 90 and 135, and then they also release a neutron, and then that neutron goes on to create another fissile reaction, and then so on and so on. And that's how the chain reaction continues to occur, and we collect energy from that activity. And then I have another one here that, yeah, I have fusion here, and it shows that it's the opposite. Fusion is taking two very light elements and squeezing them together. And when you do that, you're creating like a binding energy that gets released. And that creates a massive amount of energy. But one of the main differences between fission and fusion is like we've figured out the technical ability to create fission and control it. And we have all kinds of different engineering ways that we can do that. The ones that are in most use are the ones that were like the most economical to mass produce and repeat and make them operate at really high capacity factors. Whereas there's physical and engineering challenges to getting fusion operating at that scale. Like there's been some interesting experiments like recently that have shown that they can create more energy than it had took to create the fusion reaction in the first place, but it's a long way from the laboratory to like full scale commercial operation generating gigawatts of power. So someday we will probably accomplish that, but it's been decades away for decades, and it still feels like we're a while away from accomplishing nuclear fusion at a large commercial scale. But when
So
we
it's
do,
almost like a small, like small explosion almost.
essentially, yeah. But like, because what's happening is when you're trying to push two protons against each other, they're positively charged, so they are repelling each other. But then in the nucleus, there's it's called just like a binding energy that if you can overcome that, you can release an obscene amount of energy from just the process of fitting them together. But you have to overcome that natural repelling force. So that's one of like the interesting things about like nuclear physics is like when you're studying the nucleus, like protons repel each other. So it makes you ask yourself like, well, then how does the nucleus stay bound together, it's because there's other forces that are even like at the smaller level underneath the nucleus with like gluons and muons, and I won't get into too much of that stuff, but the protons and the neutrons are made up of smaller subatomic particles that are binding them together to keep the nucleus stable. But then sometimes if you add another neutron into that environment, the just they become unstable and they'll rift apart, and that's how we learned how to accomplish nuclear fission. And then we started boiling water with it and generating electricity.
Interesting. That's crazy. Like there's a whole whole new world. How does this like we now know basically what nuclear fusion and nuclear fission is, and I think you also wanted to show us what the nuclear power plants and like why they are now so expensive to build, or is there like some step in between?
Yeah, I had one other topic that I wanted to get to before there, because it's mostly about like the biological like hazard that radiation poses, because that is one of the concerns that a lot of people have about using nuclear power at mass scale, is because radioactivity is like it's an invisible hazard that most people do not understand very well at all. But like what they also don't realize is that like the earth is made up of radioactive elements. Like there are places on the planet, there's a beach in Brazil that has sand that is rich in thorium, that people that go to that beach, they're exposed to background levels of radiation that are higher than what like the industry standards are set at for what we should be releasing from a nuclear reactor. And there's cosmic radiation, like even our bodies contain radiation. Like if you've eaten a banana recently, you've consumed the radioactive element potassium 40. And where I get where I want to get to that is that like our cells are capable of constantly repairing damage done to them, like even at the DNA level. Um, and yeah, I was yeah. So like the logic of that, it applies to different things than just radiation. So like if you're doing muscle, like if you're exercising your muscles, you're causing damage to your muscles and then your body repairs them. Sometimes like your immune system, it benefits from exposure. It becomes stronger by exposing it to pathogens. Like your metabolism has different responses to like fasting or certain like foods that you might be consuming. And then there's the heat stress and cold stress. Like these are all stimulus to your body, and like radiation fits a similar pattern. Like it's if you're exposed to it, your body does learn how to repair it. Like our living systems, they're anti-fragile, to use a word that we use often in the Bitcoin space, because it's this we do have the capability to repair damage done by radiation at low levels. But where this comes in is that when we were first handling radiation, like early in like the 40s and the 50s, when it was a more of a novel technology that we didn't understand very well, we established very conservative thresholds for how we treat radiation and the hazards that it poses. So what happened was, when before we even had the capability of detecting low level radiation, experiments were done to show the damage and the hazard posed by large doses of radiation. And what that showed is that there is beyond a certain threshold, it can cause so much damage that your body can't repair, and can cause organ failure and issues with your blood. And there's many different yeah many different things that it can do to the human body at extreme levels. But what they did was they extrapolated that down to the bottom corner of the chart. So actually, I have in my next chart is shows this one quite well. Where'd you go? Yeah. So what I'm talking about is on this chart. It's the LNT line where it showed that it shows that they were able to measure high doses of radiation, and they just extrapolated that in a straight line through to the zero bound. And that was the most conservative estimate that they could make at the time, because they couldn't actually measure the lower left corner of that chart. But over time, as we've gotten more sensitive instrumentation to detect radiation, we've actually seen that there's more of a hormesis effect, which is showing that at low doses, our body is not only not harmed by it, but it can gain small benefits from exposure to small amounts because it facilitates the pathway for your body to repair it over time. And as it becomes more familiar, like most other things, like when you do more exercise, your body becomes more efficient at recovering each successive time that you're putting it under a stress. But then, like everything else, there is a line, there's a threshold where you can overload it. So, like jumping off a box off a 1 meter box 100 times is different than jumping a one making a 100-meter fall. You're going to have a very different outcome, even though cumulatively you jumped 100 meters. So it's an interesting exercise in how we established the LNT as like the conservative model, and then that became the foundation for all of the regulatory frameworks for nuclear power, which assumed that it's potentially hazardous at any dose rate and it's cumulative over time. Whereas as more evidence has accumulated, that that's not quite accurate compared to the hormesis model that fits the observed data that we've collected over the last 80 years since we've been working with radiological material and nuclear fission. And it's one of the reasons why it has become more and more expensive to build nuclear power, because it sets like higher safety standards. So then you need to include more safety features in the nuclear reactors so that you are keeping the exposure to the workers and the the surrounding environment to an absolute minimum, which after a while you reach a point where there's diminishing returns on that. So for every like additional like $1 million you might spend, you might get like an extra 0.01% like safety benefit out of it. So there's trade-offs when you start getting at that level of like we want them to be as safe as possible, but when you start pushing it beyond like what's reasonably achievable at actual like economic costs, it makes it difficult to justify building some of these things because they push the cost like way out into like astronomic levels.
The first thing that every Bitcoiner does, and the most important activity that every Bitcoiner keeps on doing, is buying Bitcoin. And I personally use Relai to buy and sometimes also spend or sell my Bitcoin. And there are two main reasons why I do so. The first one is it's Bitcoin only. They do not do any shit coins. They do not do any cryptos, any stocks, or anything else. This is a tool, an app that is fully focused only and solely on Bitcoin. The second one is self-custody. They give you the keys to your Bitcoin the moment you buy them. You never give them the control over your Bitcoin, and you don't have to trust them because you can verify that you and only you have the keys to your Bitcoin. There's no third-party risk. There's no freezing of your assets. There's no rug pulling. There's nothing of that. Download Relai, the app, on your phone, or go to relay.app on your browser and use code Robin to save fees and get cheaper Bitcoin. I want to tell you about something very special to me. It's called Microseed. If you hold your Bitcoin in self-custody, and you should, you know how critical it is to secure your seed phrase. You should not have them on paper. You should not have them on anything else than titanium. With Microseed, you can engrave your 12 or 24 word seed phrase, the entire seed phrase, onto a one 1-inch small washer. Yes, just one washer. All 24 words on that one washer. You can hide that thing everywhere. And even better, you don't need to buy a new kit every time you have to get a new wallet. You can make unlimited backups because Microseed is not selling the washer. Microseed is selling the device that stamps the washer. So you get the full kit with the device, with the washers, with the hammer, with everything you need to get started today. And you can make with that unlimited amount of backups. Go now to microseed.io. Almost like maybe, I don't know if it's the comparison is good, but in the flight industry, you have so many taxes now, and it's still cheaper usually than the train. I mean, within Europe, but it makes the whole flight experience, even though it's still very cheap, a lot more expensive than it would need to be complete when the free market completely would be on its own. I mean, there's like so many different taxes on flights where I think over 50% of the ticket is just taxes.
Yeah, and that just in nuclear, like, it compounds the public fear of radiation, because if zero risk is the goal, and you're making the costs just explode astronomically, but then it justifies the fear of the technology. Like, if you act like it is more dangerous than it actually is, then it makes the fear of it more justified, and then it almost creates like a feedback loop where then it's just you creating standards that are nearly impossible to meet, and it creates a perception that nuclear power and radiation is uniquely dangerous. But like, as far as like working with it in an environment where radiation is the norm in my workplace, like it's just another industrial hazard. Like, in fact, like, if you were to look at many of the workplace injuries that happen in a nuclear power plant, the like there you are more likely you're going to see a lot more hazards related to electricity, heavy moving parts, like using cranes, using that like heat and steam. Like, those are more common like hazards that cause way more workplace injuries than dealing when working with radiation. Not to say that there hasn't been any issues with that. Like, in the enrichment process, there have been a few instances where it created a fission reaction out in an uncontrolled environment that caused a hazard for the workers. But when it's controlled, like, we can do amazing things with nuclear power. Like, for example, like the chart that we had earlier with the cobalt 60. Cobalt is, in an uncontrolled state, is harmful because it is releasing radioactive like particles that you do not want to be exposed to. But when it's controlled, we use cobalt 60 as a means to sterilize medical equipment. So that's like a life-saving treatments that have been essential to have cobalt 60 as part of the supply chain to provide that service. And then there's like other ones, like not just like cobalt 60 because it's just used for sterilization, but then in nuclear medicine there's radioisotopes that we create in nuclear reactors that are then used for like diagnostics, for cancer treatments, for like tracing in like the bloodstream. There's a number of applications where nuclear technology has saved millions of lives, but that's not as well known as compared to the sensational accidents that have happened. So it's yeah, when you see, yeah, it's easier to see the big sensationalized accidents than the very like kind of under the radar, just servicing like a vital aspect of our medicinal apparatus that's saving lives every day.
The argument of what if it goes wrong, always very annoyed when it comes to innovation. when the argument is of like, okay, for example, self-driving cars, we have like, oh, what if it goes wrong? What if a car kills a human being? This is always a stupid argument for me, because it's not, if the technology is not safe enough, we should invest more to make the technology better, not to just like stop innovating and stop doing progress in field. Then there's also like the thing where people focus a lot on the one small thing that could go wrong and how horrible it would be, and don't see the benefits. If we come back to the self-driving cars, they are like cars that have assistance in the driving in the traffic are a lot more safe than if they don't have those safety features turned on. Cars that will drive themselves, I think, in like when it's like mainstream, will drive 10 times, 100 times, or like even 1,000 times safer than any human being, just because they have more eyes around them, they don't sleep, they don't get tired and all of that. And so like we have to kind of keep investing and keep pushing innovation forward, and not always focus on the one thing that like, oh, if that goes wrong, it's really bad. Like, of course, if a car just overlooks a child and drives over it, like that's horrible. But that doesn't, but we shouldn't focus on that one argument. We should focus on the car, because it was driving itself, already saved like 20 other lives, because it's so much safer to do it with self-driving. Now, this is like maybe a controversial comparison, but I'm always a little bit annoyed when someone uses the "what if it goes wrong" argument against innovation, because it shouldn't be a stop sign. It should just be like, let's go deeper into it.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the ways that we do like risk assessment, is just like it's not just the scale of the hazard. So like, yes, if something goes wrong and a nuclear reactor melts down, like what happened at Chernobyl, that is a horrible event. But the probability of that happening is also so incredibly low. So you have to measure it against the scale of the hazard versus the probabilistic nature of it even happening. And yeah, there's been the three major events that people are familiar with: Three Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. But there's there's 450 nuclear reactors operating in the world right now, something in that ballpark, that have just that most people aren't even aware of, because when it's going well, when it's working properly as it should be, it's kind of boring. But then that's like the unseen side of that's the other side of the coin that's not as well seen. And then there's the other angle of just like energy itself is probably one of the most life-saving technologies. Our ability to create electricity, to create heat, to harness it, to enhance our standards of living. Like when you see examples of like how people still live in countries of Africa, where their choice is, yeah, either they have no heat or electricity at all, or they're burning coal, they're burning, like in many cases, dung and biofuels to provide that energy for themselves. Whereas like we take it for granted in the Western nations in Europe, where we have this highly developed and sophisticated energy systems, where we just turn the lights on and it's there, and it's like the likelihood of a blackout is very improbable unless there's a snowstorm or a major thunderstorm. Um, but like when I visited Ghana a few years ago to go to the African Bitcoin conference, it was just a norm that everyone just expected, just like randomly the lights are going to go out for a few hours and you're just going to fire up the generator, and everybody carries around a pocket full of battery banks for their phones. It was a surreal experience coming from like a privileged environment in Ontario, where our system is just so robust that is not normal to us. And then it's interesting to observe that there are some countries, there are places that had very robust and high level like energy systems, like countries like Lebanon and like South Africa, where they had like everything was really good for them, but then various factors have created an environment where their systems are not as reliable anymore, and they went from having high uptime energy systems to now like intermittent energy systems, where uh, brownouts and blackouts are normal. And like that's even harder than than just having nothing at all. Like if you're starting from zero and you're not used to having electricity at all, that's a much different case than if you had electricity, you had built a society, you built cities around high uptime electricity availability, and then that starts to go away. Like you have things like refrigeration, like your like medicine, like just yeah, there's countless applications that have built a reliance on that electricity, and then when it becomes unstable, that can be very unsettling for a country that was just used to being at a having stable power systems.
Is nuclear the best source of energy?
It's the highest density, which basically means that we can generate the most with it in the smallest footprint. So like everything has its trade-offs. Like there's obviously risk associated with it, and it has to be handled with great care. But like everything has its benefit. Like hydro has great benefits, but then in many cases you're flooding a lot of land and displacing a lot of the environment. And if there is people living there, then they're going to be disrupted. So there's that is one of the negative trade-offs of building hydroelectric. There's like coal and natural gas. They're great and they're reliable, but then they're also polluting and they have their emissions. So there's that trade-off. Like wind and solar, they have application, like they can be beneficial in certain applications, but then what we're noticing is that too much of it saturating the grid creates an interesting dynamic that we were not anticipating, where our systems were built to assume like steady uptime generators. So now incorporating a lot of intermittency where the sun's not always shining and the wind's not always blowing, or sometimes it's too much at a time, so it can be pushing too much power onto these grids, but it's not consistent in a system that was built and designed for consistency. So now we're having to add on all kinds of extra features like storage to capture like the sun when it's generating, when it's not fully being utilized, so that it can be arbitrage to the times of the day when it is being utilized. Same with like the wind. And then you also have to assume that there's going to be periods where you're not going to be having wind and solar power available because it can just cut out just at a moment's notice. So we have to be very good at predicting weather patterns to anticipate such events so that you can switch over to like reliable power generating stations, which then you almost need to have several gas plants ready and available on backup to be activated should there be an instance where you had lots of solar generating and then it goes away quickly. And then yeah, we're also having to add like a lot of batteries, which add additional costs to these systems. And we're just trying to figure out a new way through this environment. Like yeah, we want to be able to use these all of these power systems in a very cohesive way that kind of complement each other, but each one poses its different challenges to integrate them all together successfully without like cannibalizing each other's loads and causing like economic challenges. And then some will get better tax credits and like subsidies, whereas others don't get the same. So then when they're competing in the market, there's different economic dynamics when like one generator is be able to be profitable even if the cost the price of the power on the grid is very low. So like you maybe you want a nuclear power plant that consistently is wants to earn like 6 cents kilowatt hour, but then like a windmill farm is getting tax credits, like they can still be profitable if the power goes like to negative 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So there's many dynamics like that where it causes imbalances in these systems that weren't quite anticipated, and it was a lot caused by like ideological reasons to want to put non-emitting sources of power onto the grid, but then it reaches a threshold where that starts to become incredibly challenging and have diminishing returns as you scale them up. So but yeah, as far as like nuclear power, I'm a big fan of it. Its biggest challenge is approaching and applying it to different markets than it is applied to today. Like every nuclear reactor that exists today is like typically near a big city where it has a big industrial load that's attached to it. So they're able to fully utilize all of the capacity that's available into them in like gigawatt scale. But now there's an interesting push to try and develop nuclear technology that's at a smaller scale, like 300 megawatt reactors and under is what they categorize as a small modular reactor. And then even further, anything under 10 megawatts, that will be considered a microreactor. But the trade-off is you're losing your economy of scale. Like if you're generating gigawatts, you can generate a lot of electricity and you can recover a lot of your capital by selling a lot of that power. Whereas if you're going to build a 10 megawatt reactor in a remote community that's off grid, you're going to run into challenges using all of that power all of the time, because like electricity is kind of like a time and place dependent commodity, where if your local environment isn't using it all the time, like the best example that Bitcoiners will be familiar with is what Gridless is doing in Africa, where they'll find and identify like small microgrids that have not been fully utilizing the power that they have available to them. Like say they have like a 500 kilowatt hydroelectric dam, but for part of the day they're only using 40 to 50% of that, and then overnight they might only be using as much as like 20% of that. So filling in that margin between supply and demand is incredibly critical, especially if we want to put nuclear reactors in these microgrid environments. But if we can solve that problem, there's a big opportunity to apply nuclear power to a lot more markets.
Do you think I mean, it probably already is used for Bitcoin mining, but do you think like Bitcoin mining and nuclear power is actually like a really interesting combination?
I think that it is going to enable us to pull this off in a way that we wouldn't have been able to consider it before. Like there's many other technologies that they're looking at to fill this margin. Like they wanted there's proposals to use hydrogen generation, desalination technologies, various just like industrial applications to like produce like aluminum or other various commodities that require like refining minerals. But all of them have various constraints. Like if you're not using hydrogen where it's being produced and you have to store it or transport it, you end up having a greatly increased costs. But where Bitcoin mining is advantageous is that it's completely dematerialized. So you're just parking a data center on an energy source and you're able to fully utilize every bit of electricity that's being generated at any time of the day. And the unique feature of the Bitcoin miners is they're incredibly flexible and tolerant to disruption wherever they might be, because it's a globally distributed operation, taking away a small amount of it from one specific jurisdiction that's just in off-grid, say like northern Canada. That's not going to have any immediate impact on the broader Bitcoin network. Like we've even seen instances like it's cool to watch what happens in the ERCOT grid and like the parts of America where the Bitcoin miners are already participating in demand response programs, which are like formal programs that the grid offers to participate in, where you will be compensated for shutting down your load during times of grid stress. So for most of the time, they're just on operating, consuming power that wouldn't and paying for it that otherwise wouldn't have a use case. Whereas when, say, a winter storm rolls by and the power usage from the local grid increases dramatically, the Bitcoin miners are then compensated through these demand response programs to reduce their load. And in some instances, like if you go to I think by like January 13th to 15th, um, on the if you look at like the hash rate charts, if you can find any of them somewhere, you can actually see a dip in the hash rate when there was a winter storm in America, and that is pretty cool that we can actually like see them responding in the Bitcoin like on-chain metrics, participating in a service that is of a great benefit to the grid. Like some people will argue that like their existence is putting a strain on the grid because they're consuming more power. But the fact that they've proven that they are able to participate in these demand response programs, they are actually reducing the strain on the grid, because now the grid operators know that they have several gigawatts of capacity that can be released and redeployed at a moment's notice. and then as soon as the event passes, it will come back online and start paying for electricity again. So it's an interesting use case, that then seeing that they're capable of that, like if they're capable of doing that on grid, they're capable of doing that off grid. And essentially, what I would envision is take the model that Gridless has developed and apply that to what we want to do, to put nuclear reactors and microreactors in microgrids all over. Like northern Canada is part of our plan here in for the Canadian nuclear industry. And ideally I would love to see like a constellation of like little clusters of these things that then all like integrate together, and then over time they can start connecting their infrastructure with each other, and we can really like develop our northern regions to like the capabilities that they should be at.
It's pretty astonishing when you think about how Bitcoin mining can monetize additional power that you otherwise couldn't monetize because the use case wouldn't be there in that region. And in times where there's a lot of energy needed, you can turn those Bitcoin miners off and basically balance the load. And so you're a lot more variable with that. I'm even thinking that every energy producer, every energy, how they call it, the energy companies that do all those things, they have to be Bitcoin miners. And I think even like Bitcoin mining companies will go in the energy game long term. Otherwise, it's just like natural incentives, I think, drive them there.
Oh yeah, it makes sense. Like if you own power and you have a situation where you have excess, like Bitcoin mining is probably the most effective tool to ensure that it's monetized and made full use of. And are you familiar with the pioneer species idea that Brandon Quittem writes about?
The most important thing for your Bitcoin journey is not buying Bitcoin, but it's how to keep them. And yes, you have maybe the right tools, but how do you actually go ahead and stick it all together so it's the most secure for you personally? Self-custody is a deeply personalized journey, and the Bitcoin way is helping you exactly finding that correct setup for you personally. They are also helping you with securing your own cybersecurity. And if you want to go one step above all that, you can even get a consultation for a Plan B residency. Go to thebitcoinway.com/Robin and you will get a 30-minute free consultation. I finally and officially mine Bitcoin. This is not just something to stack more Satoshis, but it's most importantly also to support the network. Individual miners are the ones that keep the Bitcoin network decentralized. And by the way, you get KYC free Bitcoin. That's why I use Simple Mining. I get an actual proper Bitcoin miner. They set it up for me. They repair it if it breaks down. And most importantly, they let me choose the pool and even connect my own full node. I'm completely sovereign and I'm completely in control, and I can sign up with Ocean, no account needed. I just give them a Bitcoin address and then there's mining going on. No KYC, nothing. So if you're ready to mine Bitcoin, go to simplemining.io, tell them you come from Robin, and let's mine Bitcoin together. Yeah, he was actually on the podcast and I think he talked about it, but it's been a while.
Like it's just essentially this idea of replicating what happens in ecology, where a low level plant like a moss or a lichen will start seeding into a barren landscape, like say somewhere that was just like wrecked by a volcano or something, and then they start breaking down the soil and making the environment more accommodating for higher order plants to come in. And then as you get bigger, more sophisticated plants in that environment, the original pioneers, the lichen and the moss, they will not be, the environment's no longer accommodating to them, so then they get pushed out and then they will go and seed somewhere else. So the idea that Brandon was popularizing, like feels like years ago now, is that Bitcoin miners can play the exact same role. They can plant the seeds of in like an electricity and energy system wherever we need to. And then as it matures and you have more sophisticated buyers of power, more industry, more more commodity production, more refining, more like a bigger hospital, more schools, just more local use of that power, you can then migrate the miners to another jurisdiction where they can actually be of use. And so you just kind of like almost like a waterfall e- cascade where they like yeah each one like as they become serve their usefulness in the first system, they'll go and migrate to a second system and then a third system, and then eventually they'll probably reach a point where they're no longer economical to run anymore because of just the nature of the difficulty adjustment and the halving and the changing efficiency of Bitcoin miners. But that does seem to be tapering off in an interesting way where it's going to open up a lot more use cases for Bitcoin mining, like especially in things like heat reuse and probably keep each successive generation of miners will probably be in operation for like 5 to 6 years instead of like the historical like 2 to 3 years where it was normal for them to kind of pass on in the early years as they were increasing in efficiency at a rapid rate. They would become obsolete faster, but that now that that rate is slowing down, you have a lot longer runway where a miner of like a previous generation to be actually useful. And like you can use that to your advantage too, because then you can have different tiers of Bitcoin miners in these systems. Like say you have a portion of your power where you're always going to have that load available. That's where you want your most efficient Bitcoin miners operating. But then you might have like a second tier where you want to have that flexibility. So you'll have like an older generation of ASIC that can capture that without the same economic disadvantage that you would have of shutting down like your most efficient miners. So like you can kind of play balancing trade-off games like that as these systems get more sophisticated and energy producers start to learn and understand the value of using this technology to their advantage.
There is this was this popular saying of Trump when he came into office, saying we will have too much energy. People tell him to not have as much energy in America, something like that. Was super entertaining to watch. Do you think that at some point we will be as a human species so good in producing energy that we have way too much of it, and we just like put all the excess energy to Bitcoin mining? I mean, ratification. Ratoshi was on the show, and he talked about how 99% of the all the energy will be at some point used to mine Bitcoin, because with 1% we can do everything that humans want to do.
Yeah, yes and no, because like I think like what will happen is like there will always be a portion of electricity like going forward that's going to be used for Bitcoin mining and using it to seed and grow our energy like availability as is going to like ramp it up a lot. But then we're also going to have an interaction with Jevons paradox where if we are able to create more power and make it cost less for the end consumer, people are going to find ways to use way more electricity. And we also have to consider that like we per capita we use a ton of electricity in like Canada and America and in parts of Europe. But if we were to even to bring up the developing world to our standards, like that's going to require immense amounts of energy generation to develop for them in like parts of Africa and South America. Whereas like we're still going to continue marginally increasing our consumption, and like this AI demand is just getting just outrageous, the amount of power that they're looking for. But they're going to run into interesting constraints too, because like they're probably going to have similar efficiency gain curves to what we've seen with the Bitcoin miners in their early years. So like an GPU cluster that's purchased today in 4 years might be obsolete because they've got new GPUs at that time that are going to be way more efficient and doing way more computation with way less electricity. So there's going to be some like interesting balancing between how we plan for that. And like, because who knows, there might be a massive efficiency breakthrough where what we are expecting right now is a massive demand of power from AI, but maybe somebody unlocks something that reduces that by orders of magnitude, and then we don't need the power that we were looking at. And then we get in a situation where, like, yeah, like right now, I think like Meta just signed like a 2.1 gigawatt deal with a company in Ohio where they're going to use a lot of power from their nuclear reactors. Um, but then, yeah, keep going off on another tangent, but that creates another interesting example, because now if Meta is buying 2.1 gigawatts from the power that's in Ohio, if they don't build new power, now that's going to put more strain on the rest of the consumers that are part of that grid system, because they're going to have increased costs. They're going to have to increase like all of the infrastructure to deliver that power, and they're going to need to build more generation assets in order to fulfill the demand. Because like 2 gigawatts of power, that's like city size, and this is just for single data centers. So like we're talking massive scale changes in our and how we view these power systems. Because yeah, AI is a fascinating new technology, but it's yeah, adapting to it and its power needs is going to cause some turbulence.
It's really interesting because if you think about the we getting more efficient with using the energy we have, we producing more energy and getting more efficient in that also, but then also we will keep coming up with new reasons why we need more energy. And this is a really good one where what are all those countries doing that barely use any energy compared to the Western world, to USA and Europe? Just keeping them up to our standards would require a lot more energy.
Oh,
So yeah, there's a long way to go, I guess. And like a lot of way to ground.
yeah, and like ideally, I would like to see them embrace like nuclear power. There's countries like Egypt has nuclear reactors under construction right now. South Africa has a has an operating nuclear reactor. Then recently at the COP conference a few years ago, there was an announcement that 20 something countries pledged to expand global nuclear capacity by, I think, 3x by 2050. And some of those countries were in Africa. So I know like Ghana was one, I think Uganda, uh, Nigeria. There was a few that like are very eager to develop nuclear capabilities and nuclear technology in their nations, because they have massive populations that will require massive amounts of electricity to bring up their standards of living to the equivalent of what we have here in the West. And like hopefully we can accomplish that within the timelines that they're looking at. But that's only 25 years away. And in the last 25 years, there has not been many nuclear reactors built in the world. Like I could probably name off on like one hand, maybe two hands. Like there's the ones that they just finished in Georgia. There was one in Finland that was recently finished. I think they just finished one in France, and there's the two under construction right now in the UK. And aside from like China, Russia, and India, coincidentally, three countries that did not sign on to that pledge, they are the ones that are actively building more nuclear power. Like India and China, it's mostly domestically, but then Russia is working with other partners like globally to share their nuclear technology, and they're the ones working with Egypt. Like they were working with Turkey, uh, Hungary, Bangladesh. There's probably one or two others that I'm missing, but they're actively continuing to develop the technology and get more efficient at it and more effective and build it for cheaper. So it is interesting just to see the contrast of those nations have maintained their capabilities and developed them even further, whereas in the West it's almost stagnated. Like after Fukushima, Like the nuclear industry was basically on life support. Like you're close to Germany, so you would have seen what they did there and shut down all of their nuclear reactor, and now they're more dependent on coal than they ever have been in recent decades. And like yeah, the US too, like they shut down a bunch of nuclear reactors with the intent to replace them with windmills and solar panels, and it got replaced by more imports from Quebec and more natural gas. So it didn't quite go as planned.
Yeah, it's probably never a good idea for a country to be more dependent on another country.
Yeah, well, especially when like that's an adversarial country to begin with. Like it's one thing to have dependencies upon like friendly countries, but if at a moment's notice they can take an adversarial stance and cut you off completely, like that's risky business.
Crazy. Um, is there something we've missed in the 1 hour we covered now? Nuclear power and the topics that are important for you.
Well, there's one other thing with like the Bitcoin angle that I've been thinking about because we can probably use it beyond just mining. Like when I first started going down this rabbit hole and I learned about mining and like that was what clicked first because I was aware of what Canada's intentions were to build nuclear reactors and microgrids and the challenges that they were having with ensuring that they were going to get full use out of it. That seemed obvious, but now having been in the Bitcoin space for a little bit longer and seeing things like treasury reserves or using it as collateral asset, using it for just wealth preservation for like long-term liabilities, I started to look around the nuclear industry to see where that those different applications can be useful. Like, and there's definitely opportunities here in this sector that we can take advantage of Bitcoin's utility as a store of value and wealth preservation and collateral asset in terms of yeah, like the first one that came to mind for me was when a nuclear reactor is built, a lot of its costs are front loaded. Like even much of the cost of decommissioning and waste management at the end of its life, which will be 40, 60 years in the future, they have to start a fund to cover those costs decades later. And in the typical format that they do it, they used all like your fiat instruments. You can use like treasury bonds, there's equities, like real estate, all the typical portfolio things to preserve that value against the constant erosion of inflation. And I've been suggesting that yeah, Bitcoin should be a part of those portfolios, even just to complement and supplement what they're already using to ensure that there's a well-preserved fund for when we need it decades from now. And then, and like another challenge that nuclear has is like on the insurance front. It's very difficult to insure a nuclear reactor, but like what if we could create some sort of like Bitcoin insurance product where we have that reserve appreciating in the background available to use should there be an instance where it needs to be deployed. Like almost thinking like the there's the company I heard the guy talking about it recently. The company's Meanwhile, and they're a Bitcoin life insurance company. And so what they were doing is they're denominating life insurance in Bitcoin. So in a way, I was thinking about how that could be transferred to like used for an asset like a nuclear power plant. And then there's other angles like in the early stages of building a nuclear reactor, you're going to have like periods where capital sits idle, where you're doing like regulatory work, pre-construction work, and a lot of that stuff. And then there's also risks of like construction overruns where it may take longer than planned to build these things. And so you have to make sure that you can cover that cost because that can either like make or break a project. Like sometimes there's been nuclear reactors that have been nearly finished or even finished, and they were never even turned online. Um, but there's like a moral hazard in having like a construction overrun fund if it's there. Like it creates an incentive where if you are going to have a payout if you overrun your budget or your construction timeline, it that might incentivize the construction companies to be like, oh, you have that backstop, so then there's less risk of failure. But if you had that as Bitcoin, then there would be more incentive to be on time and on budget, because the longer that you can go without having to touch that reserve, because it will appreciate in value over time, then there will be more available for future use, and it can be used to fund like future liabilities, like some of these reactors, at their midlife, they'll go under refurbishments to extend their life for another like 40 years, which is what we're doing in Ontario right now. Like our entire fleet of reactors is undergoing reconstruction so that they will last well into like the 2060s. But again, like they had to raise money for that just before they went ahead and started with these projects. So and then the final angle was like applying something like the bit bond, where it's like when you raise capital initially, you raise a bond that's going to be able to fund the project in fiat for the most part, but then also sets aside a part of that reserve as Bitcoin for future liabilities. And so I've been thinking about how we can use those aspects of Bitcoin for many of these longer term and like midterm liabilities that nuclear power plants have to endure, because one of the biggest challenges that we have, like in nuclear, is that fiat, like inflationary environment, has not been kind to the financing of nuclear power. But when I speak to people in the industry, like they take that as a given, because they're just the monetary substrate that we exist in, and this, the fiat environment is just the discount rates and inflation rates and just the interest rates. Those are all just taken as a given, because they don't see any alternative monetary system to even perceive this challenge through. But then, having been in the Bitcoin space, like the Bitcoiners start to see almost like two different monetary systems, so you can like see how they interact against each other. Like I recall one of your guests recently had mentioned Thomas Kuhn and like the structure of scientific revolutions, and he does an interesting job of elucidating this effect where like you can see two different paradigms, and like once you see the new paradigm, like the old paradigm seems like almost like archaic in comparison, but the people that have built their entire careers and their lives and their understanding in this older paradigm, they will fight tooth and nail to resist having to adapt into the new paradigm. Like he uses several scientific breakthroughs, like the Copernican revolution, when with with the heliocentric model about the earth revolving around the sun and not the sun revolving around the earth. But like there was entire like a wealth of knowledge that was established under the assumption that the sun revolved around the earth and not the other way around. So when the observations were made that it was actually the earth revolving around the sun, that forced a completely readaptation of the paradigm of like understanding the cosmos. And like it feels like we are going through a shift like that in the monetary world, where the fiat system was just what everyone knows. Like you'll even hear like an economist they'll talk about like, oh, in my first year economist class, we know that if money wasn't losing value, people would just stop spending it, and they treat that as such like a truism. And it just it but once you can see another way, it's like, I don't know, maybe that doesn't really jive in this alternate system that we can perceive the monetary networks through.
I mean, now we already have it. Like we have Bitcoiners and we are Bitcoiners, and I'm spending money still. Like I live on a Bitcoin standard, but like I still spend my money. I still spend my Bitcoin. Even I buy things with Bitcoin all the time. So that's clearly just wrong that we stop spending money if the money would be Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, like, I have no doubt that you've heard that argument before, and from people that have that like the classical Keynesian training, where it's just that yeah, people will hoard the money and they'll never spend it. But it's just yeah, it's a fallacy. And like you're an example, like you and like the few others like BTC sessions that have gone full on to the Bitcoin standards. Like yeah, I still have things to live, but where it changes is you probably now have a higher discernment for quality. You're not going to just spend money for the sake of spending money. You're going to have put a lot more thought into it. You're not going to buy cheap plastic crap that's going to fall apart with planned obsolescence built into it. It's yeah, it just shifts the like the quality of what you're going to spend your money on rather than just or yeah, and you're not going to invest it like a degenerate gambler, which seems to be the norm nowadays with like prediction markets and just like everything. Even like normal equities behave like friggin' meme stocks, like because it's just everyone's just trying to chase a gain just to try to catch that 100x just to get ahead, because otherwise you're just running faster just to stay in the same place.
100%. It's crazy what's happening, and I always love talking with Bitcoiners around that. And I think we've learned a lot about nuclear power today, and a lot about the relationship to Bitcoin. So thank you already much. Thank you so much already for that. One question that I ask each and every one of my returning guests is, what have you learned outside of Bitcoin since your last appearance on the podcast?
I have a book recommendation, and it was originally Mandrick had suggested this when he was on a podcast about a year ago. It's called the Hyperion series. It's a set of 4 books, and it's definitely a long read, but the topics that they explore are are very appealing to somebody that sees the world through like the Bitcoin paradigm. Like one interesting thing about it is like there's a structure that's moving backwards in time, and then there's pilgrims that are going to meet it at a point in time where it's going to like open up, and it's almost like I see interesting parallels between that and the time change, just like because we can see blocks in the future and we know when they're roughly when they're going to open up, and we're like almost moving forward to it. It's almost like the time chain is something that's already built, but then we're moving forward in time towards it. And so that was
Is that the book, the Mandarin?
no, it's called the Hyperion.
Oh, the Hyperion.
Yeah,
Like
no, it
hype.
was it was Mandrick's that Mandrick the
Oh,
baklava guy. He was the one that had suggested reading it, and like
oh,
I read this and it was like a
is it
fascinating story.
the Hyperion Cantos?
Yeah, yeah. There's 2 Hyperion stories, and then there's the Endymion stories, where it's this
Interesting.
they're 2 chunks of time. So like the first 2 books take place in one era, and then the second 2 books take place in like 300 something years later. But like events in the first story, it's like it's one of those things where like until you've read all the way to the end of the story, there's parts of like the early story that don't quite make sense, but then as you start getting that more information, then it all like clicks together, and then you can then you have that like the realization, just like, oh, like these events were all playing into each other in a way that created like the narrative. And like there's it gets into stuff just like if you knew that you were going to have to make the ultimate sacrifice despite having alternate paths to take, but it was like the best thing to do to save the world, like would you still go ahead and do it? And like there's like interesting philosophical thoughts that it provokes while you're reading. And then the other interesting thing that I did while I was reading it is I was using like the my AI chatbots just like as a reading companion. Like when it got into like some like pretty heavy philosophical or confusing stuff, like I could just go like you do risk spoilers from time to time, so but you have to be careful with that. But it kind of helps like work through some of the more like complex narratives that the story kind of weaves together. So I found that interesting way to use AI as like a book companion for like these very like high-minded sci-fi stories.
I guess you can maybe preface it a little bit with like, don't give me spoilers and stuff like that. Like I'm this part in the story. Don't spoil anything, but like explain me what's happening here, something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Or like even just like draw me a description of what is happening here. Like because they'll have like really good detailed descriptions of like a cavernous environment that they go into where there's like steps leading all the way down, and I was just like draw me a create me a visual representation of what I'm reading here, and so you can kind of use it for like interesting, yeah, very many interesting ways like that. Like I just have random thoughts, and I just prompt the AI and just be like, what do you think about this? Help me expand on this. Like it's a very useful, fun tool.
AI is, if you're already using Bitcoin and if you're already deep into Bitcoin, like explore AI. It's like 100% worth it. Really cool. We have an routine, as you know, where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the previous guest asked you the question: if you could only live in one country and eat one food, what would those be?
Oh God. Well, Canada's kind of limited. I don't know. I want to go somewhere tropical and eat pineapples. I don't know. Maybe I'll go to El Salvador and enjoy pineapples. Just not on my pizza.
I love it. So El Salvador and pineapples. I love the answer. Thank you so much, Nuclear, Bitcoin, and Ryan, so much for being on the show. Before I let you go, where can people find you and ask you questions?
On Twitter, the handle is Nuclear Bitcoiner. Yeah, I still call it Twitter. Same on Noster, Orange Pill app, or no, Club Orange now. But yeah, there's a few ways that you can get a hold of me on those things. And I tweet randomly here and there, but yeah, LinkedIn as well if you want it more professional. But yeah, thanks for having me again. It's was a great conversation. I enjoy helping Bitcoiners learn more about nuclear technology because seem to have found myself at the intersection of two very poorly understood technologies by the broader population. And yeah, weaving them together has not been an easy task, but it is quite fulfilling. So
yeah, I can imagine that. Even like there's a lot of Bitcoiners that don't understand nuclear, and there's a lot of nuclear that don't understand Bitcoin, and like 99% of the people on the earth don't understand either one of them. Like you have like very interesting intersection there.
Yeah, I definitely created a niche for myself.
Really cool. Then thank you so much for being on, and also thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening for joining us today. As always, I'll be back.
Cool. Bye.
This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial advice.